Hello, welcome to Talking Rubbish, a weekly podcast delving deep into the world of recycling and discussing the truth behind snappy headlines and one-sided stories. In this episode, we will discuss mobile phone recycling. Should the government control our packaging? Are staples rubbish or not? And I have a question about whether cans really contain plastic. I'm James Piper, author of The Rubbish Book, and I'm joined by Robbie Staniforth, my far from rubbish friend. Good morning, Robbie.
Hey, James.
We had a great story shared on Discord this week.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, thank you so much to Eats Runs on Discord. Really appreciate it. It was a story about a fly-tipped sofa.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. We don't normally promote fly tipping on this podcast, do we?
Absolutely not.
We'll make an exception for this. It was dumped in the middle of a village in Gloucestershire. Lidbrook, I think is the village. And a local photographer called Alex saw this sofa that had been dumped. I don't know how to describe this. It's sort of like in the middle of a field, on like a hard standing, someone had dumped a sofa. And Alex thought it looked really great, really funny, and just in its location, and he posted a message on his local Facebook group asking people whether they wanted to be photographed on the sofa. What is unbelievable is there now have been more than 170 locals photographed with the sofa.
Oh, whoa. Major attraction.
Yeah, but not just people, Robbie. They've had a tortoise, a chicken, a horse. Very villagey, isn't it? You know, the sofa's appeared. Get the horse.
Get the tortoise, quick.
Well, tortoises are not going to be quick, famously. Amazingly, it is actually now ranked second on TripAdvisor for things to do in Lidbrook.
Wow, okay. There's a lot going on there, clearly.
Now, I was amazed by that, but it did seem that there were only 3 things to do in Lidbrook on TripAdvisor, and I think number 1 was Alpaca World, so...
Oh, that sounds good.
Yeah, sofas aren't going to beat an alpaca, are they?
No, absolutely not.
Yeah, from what I can see, it went well beyond a sofa into basically a full-blown lounge. I don't know, Robbie, I've put a picture up there on our notes. Can you...
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to describe that to a listener?
Yeah. Oh, my God, okay, right. So, yes, it is a sofa on a hard standing, and someone's laid out a doormat on the right-hand side, and then you sort of presumably walk into the room, and there's a carpet laid out, a rug, with a table that's made with a tablecloth and vase with flowers on it. Someone's put a rug onto the sofa and even put a side table out with a plant. And behind the sofa, this is the piece de resistance, they've put a wooden window frame with curtains drawn behind it, as well as a table lamp and a newspaper stand next to it. It literally looks like a living room.
So, yes, have a look at that news article. I'll put the link in our link tree if you want to see a picture of this. And I guess, you know, while we don't condone fly tipping, it is always nice to see people making the best out of a bad situation. Unfortunately, this happy story does have a bit of a sad end.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, a bit like the snowman. You know, when you were a kid, you watched the snowman and he melted in the morning.
Yeah.
The sofa just suddenly disappeared.
Oh, no.
As did everything around it. I mean, it became... That must have been quite the clean-up because it wasn't just a sofa anymore. It was an actual lounge.
Oh, God, okay. Some poor person from Lidbrook Council had to go clear it up, did they?
We assume so. So well done, Lidbrook Council, for cleaning up the fly tipping, and well done to the local community for making the most of it. Additions and corrections. So we've had a couple of additions and corrections, both from Discord actually, so thank you so much to everyone over on Discord. As always, if you want to get into it, the link is in the show notes. That's where I draw some things for this show, so if you see anything that you want shared on the show, make sure you're over on Discord. And first of all, Philip shared something which was actually a bit more about ocean-bound plastic.
Oh yes, very tricky topic, this one.
We've talked about this a few times now. So yes, this is a bit more on ocean-bound plastic following the discussion episode 41. Basically, the Food Standards Agency has issued new guidance cautioning businesses not to use ocean-bound plastic in food packaging. Now, this is not about the terminology. This is just, please don't use ocean-bound plastic in your food packaging. This is a safety thing. So the Food Standards Agency has concluded that there is not enough evidence to confirm that this type of plastic does not pose a health risk. I guess the trouble with this is there's actually no definition for ocean-bound plastic. That's part of the problem we've got with it from a marketing claim. Like, where do you draw the line? When does something become ocean-bound? So the assessment that was actually done that the FSA are reacting to actually called for the scope to include all environmental plastic. So anything that's in the open environment should not be used for food contact.
Yeah, okay. Well, that sort of makes sense, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. I must admit, this felt like a bit of an announcement and a bit of a report to a problem that doesn't exist, because I can't imagine anyone using, plastic that they've collected in the open environment for food contact.
Well, this, coming back to, we talked about it in my visit to South Africa, there were people scavenging landfill sites there, not quite ocean-bound plastic, but definitely not plastics that you would like to be in contact with food. And so those plastics get downcycled, those PET bottles that get scavenged, whereas the ones that end up at recycling plants going back into plastic water bottles are from a much cleaner collection stream. They don't come from landfill sites or, as in this case, kind of ocean-bound, open environment plastics.
Yeah, so I guess as a reminder, or just to clarify, curbside is fine, our normal recycling is fine. We need to make sure those things are captured. And what we're saying is if it ends up in the open environment, we should not be using that with food contact. That makes loads of sense to me. And I guess the reflection is thinking back to our black plastic episode, which was episode 26. It's just an interesting topic because when we recycle materials, they can hold the chemicals or things that they've picked up in the environment. In this instance, it'll be things like UV degradation that can hold into the product that then is created from the recycling. So just an interesting reminder, that black plastic thing was fascinating because it wasn't anything that was added to the black plastic. It was just potentially using electronic plastic and that has a flame retardant in it and using that in your recycled content. We also had Paul on Discord who was talking about the Absolute vodka bottle. So we mentioned this in episode 39 and I said that Absolute Vodka had a bottle that was 57% paper and 43% plastic. And I felt that would be quite difficult to recycle. And they seem to have an agreement with Greater Manchester Council to collect up these bottles. So if you bought an Absolute Vodka bottle in Greater Manchester, it might be made of paper and you could put it in your paper recycling. I think Paul works for Greater Manchester Council.
Yeah, wow. Great to have someone on the ground then.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Thank you, Paul. So he was saying that the paper and plastic mix was a bit different to what we mentioned in the episode, and actually there was more paper, less plastic. Ooh. Now, Will Connolly from Diageo, who we interviewed in episode 40, actually also got in contact to let me know that the Absolute Vodka bottle is a Pabaco bottle.
Okay, Pabaco being the manufacturer, is that?
Yeah, I still think that's how you say it, Pabaco. Okay. And that was the one we mentioned that had different generations of bottle. So they had a version 1, version 2, version 3, and they were aiming for one that had 95% paper and 5% plastic. So I think what's happening here is the bottle is evolving and Absolute Vodka are then changing which bottle they use to increase the amount of paper and reduce the amount of plastic. And Paul confirmed that Greater Manchester spoke to the paper mill, which I think was Saker, who took some empty bottles to test, and they said it was perfectly okay to go through the ordinary paper recycling process. So they tested it, and they felt it was okay to use, and that's what happened. So really good to get someone on the ground giving us the info. Thank you so much, Paul. And Paul did acknowledge that if there was an increase in kind of usage of these kind of bottles, as we said in the episode, the more of this plastic-lined paper we have, then the harder recycling will become because they work on percentages and can take a certain mix. So we need to be careful not to kind of completely introduce paperization across the aisles. But with one particular brand who's done a lot of work, it's probably okay. We'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, EcoSurety, who are on a mission to rid the world of unnecessary packaging. They help brands navigate the tricky world of extended producer responsibility, but that is not all. They also collaborate on some incredible recycling projects and consumer awareness campaigns for those tough-to-recycle materials. If you're an organisation looking to make smarter packaging choices, check them out at ecosurety.com. And as always, the best thing you can do to help us grow is to leave us a review. And I'm going to correct you, Robbie, because last week I think you said you'll read out reviews if people leave them on Apple and Spotify. But small correction, you can only leave a written review on Apple. So.
Okay. So these are all coming from Apple, which I don't actually have access to because I'm not listening through Apple, although they come onto our website, don't they? So that's where I'm grabbing them from.
That's great. So what is Robbie's review of the week?
So I'm going to go with a short and sweet one. There's a few coming. There's so many good ones when I was looking through it. But from K1P_P1, I didn't know how much I was interested in recycling until listening to this podcast. Quickly becoming a Thursday night highlight. Oh, so nice to become someone's Thursday night highlight.
Thank you so much, K1P1. I'm assuming that's not their name. Unless they're like a Star Wars droid. This could be... Oh.
Could well
is that
be.
what they are?
Yeah, might be a Martian or a droid of some sort.
We'd love you to join our community on Discord, the link of which is in our show notes. You can follow us on social media at Rubbish Podcast. You can email talkingrubbishpodcast@gmail.com. All those links can be found in our show notes, including a link to our link tree, which covers everything we discussed today. Rubbish process. Last week we collected our mobile phones. So, Robbie, how are they recycled?
Well, I think first we've got to start. We've collected them all up. We talked about that last week. And now we're looking at the data wiping of them.
Oh, now data wiping is interesting. This has come up a lot on Discord. Like, what happens if my battery's completely dead? I can't get it out. You know, I've got an iPhone, the battery's stuck in. I can't charge it up. Should I recycle that? Because who's going to do the data wiping? And I said to you yesterday, because I was like, Robbie, are you going to write the notes for this? And you said, yeah, I'll do the notes. And I said, there's probably some form of enormous magnet that they pass phones at. Because, you know, like when you're at an airport and it's like you're a bit worried when your phone goes through the X-ray machine that it might get wiped.
Yeah.
It felt like there was like the equivalent of that in a recycler. So I just left you with that. And then just before recording today, you went, I couldn't find anything out about that gigantic magnet. And I was like...
it's a great idea, this big magnet.
I was like, I've just made it up, Rob. I don't know if that's what happens.
You said it with so much confidence and authority. I was worrying last night. I spent hours looking through for like, what's this magnet special like pulse device that wipes dead battery phones? Doesn't exist.
I've seen Ocean's 11. They use that thing in the van that takes out the whole of Las Vegas. That'll do it.
Definitely too many movies. Okay, so when it comes to data wiping, what actually happens is if you do have battery, we mentioned this last week, but worth covering again, try and restore your phone to factory settings. If it doesn't turn on properly, sometimes you can restart it in like safe mode and you can get to return to factory settings. There's also on some phones, slightly older phones, but still smartphones, there's hard reset buttons for the phones, for some of them that you can do. So try your hardest. However, if you can't get it to charge, what happens is when it gets to the other end, they have different solutions for how they might get it to replace the battery, for example, try various different chargers. They can also, through a USB cable, sometimes remotely access, not remotely, like physically access the phone from a laptop to wipe all the data out. Often, if it won't turn on and it's that damaged that you can't wipe the data yourself, the fact is it might be harvested for a few parts, but then it will be destroyed through the process and won't actually get recycled and reused. So it's a huge barrier to recycling tech. We know this, people's concerns about data. So it's really important to reassure everyone that actually, as long as you're using reputable collection companies, your data is very much safe. And to all the recyclers out there, please let us know if you're on the verge of investing in a massive magnet.
I feel like the phone, the massive magnet has been wiped from existence.
Okay, so once we've got these phones, they've had the data removed from them, all your personal data, etc., there's a pre-sort process. And this is basically looking at two things. Can the thing be resold? And if it can't be resold, particularly if it's a relatively new phone, can it be harvested for valuable parts? And this, by parts, I mean parts that can be redeployed into another phone. Because processor chips, batteries, etc., some of the parts might be quite useful, even little cameras to replace, especially on those very expensive £1,000 phones that you can now get. But if they can't, what happens through the recycling process, and this is one of those things that listeners will have to understand, there isn't one single process for mobile phones where you put a phone in at one end and out the other end of the machine comes its constituent parts. The first thing that happens is they get shredded, and that's also part of securing the data. In shredding them, they ensure that the data can't be accessed physically, because you can't put the chips together, etc. And then they use a mix of eddy currents and magnets to extract the various metals away from the rest, which is mostly mixed plastics.
I knew magnets were involved somewhere. I'm delighted.
You feel vindicated.
Absolutely.
And sometimes they will pull off things like processors and some of the precious parts of it even before it goes into the shredder. So this is a more kind of agricultural process. And then eventually, just like all the rest of the electricals, once the metals are separated, they'll go through a refinery process that we've talked about previously, that all electronic goods go through. But I did find one very interesting process that's done by the Royal Mint. So that's the organisation who make all of the currency in the UK here. And what they're doing is taking electronic components, many of which are from mobile phones, so the processor chips, etc., and they place it in a secret solution. So I could not find out, spent about half an hour last night trying to find out what this solution was, couldn't find out the info. Some secret solution that basically extracts the chemicals in the solution, extract the valuable metals and produce this sort of brown powder, which is then heated for about 30 minutes or so at over 1,000 degrees Celsius. And the end result is literally gold. So they have taken electronic components, and particularly from mobile phones, and extracted it into gold. This was about 2 or 3 years ago, the research that I found about their process, and they were looking to expand this to also extract copper, nickel, and tin from the same thing. So that's a more specialized process, but this must be a highly protected secret solution.
Amazing. You're going to get less gold in value than the device cost, though. So it's not like we gain anything from knowing the secret solution.
Well, I think it's just that the Royal Mint obviously are really trying to, gold is pretty
Well, they want it, yeah.
precious.
I can
Yeah,
understand.
they want the gold,
Absolutely.
so they're trying to pull it out. And obviously they started with gold, most valuable, and then they're going to progress on to some of the other metals. But unfortunately, I don't have an update on that. So that's how mobile phones are recycled.
Trash talk. So today we're asking, should the government control our packaging? And this is just a fancy way of asking the question, should governments be saying what's good and what's bad in what we place on the market? And this is partly because next week we're going to have an interview with OPRL, the unpack recycling label, who are heavily involved with this work, because one of the things they do is decide whether packaging should have recycle or do not recycle. So we're going to get stuck into the detail of how that label works, because we get lots of questions about that on this podcast. Loads of people asking, why does this have do not recycle? Why does this have recycle? So I'm going to line up some really good questions for them for next week. But we thought it might be worth just doing an overview of this kind of RAM that's coming in, which we've talked about a few times, but I don't think we've ever actually done an episode on. We've done episodes on EPR, but not RAM. And so just before we get started, I kind of want to just give a bit of a revision as to what's happening. So we're talking about extended producer responsibility here, which we say a lot. We talk about EPR. Just a reminder, because we might have new listeners, 2 parts to EPR. So there's this first phase, which is a local authority cost recovery mechanism. So this is, at the moment, our councils pay for our waste to be collected from our houses. So when we put out our bins every Thursday, happy bin day, when we put our bins out to be collected, that's covered by our council tax and local councils. We're moving to a situation where brands are going to cover that cost. And to start with, that is just going to be quite a simple calculation. They're just going to say, okay, the total cost of collecting from local authorities is 1.6 billion, something like, there's different numbers on there, but you'll talk about that, Robbie, in a bit. But there's this kind of overall cost that's coming in, and they'll just divide that by brands based on market share. to start with, market share of different materials and weights. That's phase one. That's when do the finances start for that, Robbie?
In October this year, October 2025, the first invoices will be seen.
Okay, so the data has started. The brands have been working out their data, what percentage of the market am I, and the finances will start in October 2025. Then in the future, there's this thing called RAM, which is the Recycling Assessment Methodology, which skews those payments based on how recyclable your item is. And that's what we want to talk about today. Now, when we've talked about in the past about like the glass industry being annoyed, for example, they're annoyed about the first part. So they're annoyed about EPR just in general because the market share is done on weight. So they will pick up a higher part of the cost because they are in a heavier material. Now, defenders of that system will argue, yes, but it is expensive from a carbon perspective. It's hard to create glass and it's hard to recycle glass. You need a lot of heat. Because of the cost of electricity in the UK, as far as I know, none of our glass recyclers or glass smelters use electricity yet, which would be a way of decarbonising glass smelting. So again, we need them to evolve into that. We need electricity prices to come down or people to recognise that they should be just powering these things with electricals regardless of the cost. Then you can start saying, okay, well, glass is now a better material. But I think I'm sort of 50-50 on it. I understand their frustration that if you penalise glass, you promote plastic. And that is, I can understand why that's frustrating. Equally, glass is not perfect. It's heavy and it's hard to melt and recycle. So there is an argument to say it should have a higher cost. But I can understand why that's happening. And there's lots and lots of things happening with the government in terms of lobbying to reduce the cost for glass. And we will report on that in the future. We're not going to talk too much about glass today. Now, they're annoyed about the first bit, which is that LA cost recovery. They are less annoyed about the RAM, the Recycling Assessment Methodology, because glass is seen as quite favourable in that.
Yeah, that's exactly right, because it is recyclable, and we're going to get onto that in a sec. But if you're a glass manufacturer, glass recycler, glass user, you'd say, hey, this stuff's been recycled back into bottles for years.
Yes, absolutely. So, Robbie, let's get into the detail on the second bit, on the RAM, the Recyclability Assessment Methodology.
Yeah, so that's what it stands for, and it's been in the works by government for years now, like years and years, that we're going to move to a system that sort of grades packaging based initially on how recyclable it is.
Yeah, I mean, this is my big frustration, that it has been going on for years. And I've been talking about EPR in the UK with brands since 2015, I think. And I remember when Brexit was voted for in 2016, and I was CEO of EcoSurety, and I was emailing the team saying EPR was going to be uncertain. So it has been talked about a lot. Now, in a brand's defence, because brands would say, well, we haven't heard about it. It's all well and good you knowing about it, James. You're in the industry. We haven't heard about it. And so in a brand's defence, I think DEFRA have sort of relied on webinars, emails, voluntary things for people to get involved with. It's been less kind of media focused. And so the reality is big brands engage with that sort of stuff and small brands don't. And
yeah, no, that's exactly right.
And the only time you experience it as a small brand is when there's an article in the paper that makes you angry. And you're thinking, God, this really affects my business. Why didn't I know about it? And you kind of wish there was a media report earlier on that said, you know, this is coming, prepare for it. But the media don't really write those stories. They write the everyone's angry about it. It actually makes me think about when legislation was introduced, when the waste electricals legislation was introduced. I think it came in on the same day that they banned smoking in pubs.
Oh, really?
I think so. And so I think it was 2007. And so loads of people who thought they were going to get good media coverage about the waste electricals legislation, all the coverage was about smoking in pubs being banned.
Yeah. And you can sort of see why, can't you?
Absolutely. And so you miss kind of that new piece of legislation coming in if you're a small brand.
And so what happened is there's been a few different consultations about this recyclability assessment methodology, but actually really things only started progressing over the last sort of 6 to 12 months or so, to be frank. The government commissioned eventually commissioned two separate organisations to try and come up with this recyclability assessment methodology. And I really can't get into the politics of it because it's a very long-winded story. But actually, between the years of like 2020 and 2024, there was a lot of talk about it, but not really very much action. And it only really progressed once PAC UK, that's the UK's packaging scheme administrator, it's once that organisation was formed at the sort of tail end of 2023 into 2024. And I suppose, full disclosure, I'm on the steering group of PAC UK, so I've seen this from the inside, so to speak, as it's come to fruition. But what then happened very quickly towards the tail end of last year is a consulting firm got very fast feedback from industry on saying, here's the methodology, here's what we're going to do to subdivide glass into different categories, to subdivide plastic into different categories. What do you think, industry? How should we tinker with it? And they effectively came up with a way of working quite dynamically, certainly for the way that government usually works, by not having these long-winded public consultations that take 12 weeks to run, and then lots of people will respond to it who don't really understand the tests of whether something's recyclable or not. So they actually managed to do a much more nimble process than they had previously done to try and form some of this policy, which took just, frankly, like years.
Yeah, and from my perspective, that's really positive. I think I was reading a blog actually on from one of the glass guys yesterday just to see what their views were, and I can't remember which company it was, unfortunately, but they would argue that's been quite detrimental because that uncertainty of like, we're releasing the first iteration, don't worry, it's going to be improved. That creates kind of, I personally am like, yeah, release stuff even if it's not perfect, and then evolve it and edit it and change it with industry. But their view was actually that complexity and uncertainty and changing over time was quite negative. And they were comparing it to like Trump's tariffs negatively. They were saying, look at Trump's tariffs. They just came out and said what the percentages are, and everyone just has to sort it out and deal with it.
Yeah, sure.
And I was thinking, well, that's not true, because like just recently he's changed the UK tariffs. So, you know, those numbers are not fixed and those numbers aren't certain. So arguably it's the same thing. But
yeah, it's put something out there and then very quickly amend it until you get what you actually want.
Yeah, but I mean, we're in the industry, Robbie, and we've seen lots of presentations, lots of consultations when the first RAM was released where people are like, this is rubbish, this is not good enough. And I think it frustrates me that people aren't like, this is rubbish, so how do we improve it? You know, what do we
do it this way
like,
instead?
Recognise that it's an evolution rather than just like this set in stone thing that you're going to be stuck with.
Yeah, and even what we've got now will certainly evolve more over time. They're going to review this on an annual basis as things change, because something that is recyclable today wasn't recyclable 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So things change over time, and we definitely hope that they do. That's the whole purpose of trying to become more resource efficient and have more products circulating around the economy.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, just to explain it, it's basically a traffic light system. There's red, amber and green. And red is basically something that's really difficult to recycle at scale, really difficult to collect. Amber is like medium. It's sort of, you know, there's going to be some challenges somewhere in the track, either with the collection or sorting. It might require specialist infrastructure to reprocess. That's kind of your amber. And then green is it's widely recyclable in current UK infrastructure. So what brands are going to have to do is assess their packaging and decide where they sit on that. And everything is red as a default, isn't it? So everything starts red, and then you have to prove that it's amber or green. And obviously there's some guidance of like, these things are definitely green, but you still have to do an assessment to confirm that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And when it all boils down to it, if companies don't want to do this assessment, they'll just have to assume all of their packaging is red and not recyclable. And they will know very quickly the very obvious ones that are easily recyclable, the average cardboard box.
So even if a company was only using a really clean cardboard box, that would still be red unless they got it formally assessed?
Exactly, unless they declared it as a cardboard box and therefore green.
Okay. How do they declare it?
Through the data that they submit to the government, effectively. So there will be a new data submission form, is what it's called, and they'll have to say against every line of packaging that they use for each of their products, whether it's red, amber, or green.
Okay, and then the government will check that against their guidance. Okay.
So in terms of what that means, because the recyclability assessment methodology is only as good as the consequences of your packaging turning out to be red and bad, or green and highly recyclable and good. And so what the government have proposed is that if you have packaging that's defined as red under this traffic light system, that in 2026, so next year, you'll pay 1.2 times the fee that you would be paying, say, if it was amber. And this goes up to 1.6 in their proposal in 2027 and 2 times the amount you'll pay if something's red rather than amber in 2028. And just like you mentioned earlier, James, this is a proposal. It might not end up being that. This is absolutely not set in stone. And they recently did a quick survey rather than a big public consultation of industry feedback to try and understand whether industry agreed with how it sort of those fees for red, bad packaging increase over time. And so as part of this survey, they've done some initial analysis that just came out last week, actually. They've had 180 responses from industry at large, of which 69% of them were from the large producers who make packaging. So think about those big brands and retailers out there. But there were also responses from trade associations, waste management firms, local government organisations, and things like that.
So 180 responses. I mean, just to put that in perspective, there's probably about 10,000 companies that this legislation is going to affect. And so I just think that is a very low number of responses to something that's going to really affect brands. Again, it's how much, it just goes back to that initial question, which is how much are people engaging with this, and really our call out is if you're a brand listening to this and you're not engaging with it, it's then quite difficult for you to complain about it. You sort of need to be round the table saying, this is what I feel. And I think it's fair to say that if we think there's about 10,000 companies that this affects, 180 responses, so 2% of that number is just not good enough, really.
Yeah, and it's mostly all of the usual suspects who are very large organisations who responded. And so 45% of the respondents said that they foresee changing their packaging or packaging being changed as a response to these fees. So if it goes up from 1.2 to 1.6 to 2 times multiplier over the next 3 years, that packaging will change, that the red stuff that's unrecyclable, difficult to manage, will suddenly move into formats that are easier to recycle, or they will find solutions for recycling that particular packaging format if it's absolutely required. And then moving on, 46% agreed with the methodology, which is basically the methodology for how they use the RAM to determine what fees the producer pays, is to say that amber is the base fee. So if it gets the amber categorization, then that's how much they pay. They'll get a fixed fee to uplift those fees for red. And so that's the 1.2, 1.6, 2.0. And then any excess that they make will be used to discount the green. So the green stuff, the good recyclable stuff, will get a little bit of a discount, but it will be right at the end. It's really used to penalise the red much more so than it is to sort of promote the green stuff. Because, to be frank, producers should be placing green, highly recyclable packaging onto the market. That's the expectation of this legislation. So it's not about giving them a dangling a carrot, so to speak. It's about making sure that there's a suitable stick with these red fees. And so there was really less support for exactly how much. So the fact that the red fees get this uplift and get this stick, people generally agreed with, or there was a strong agreement to, there was less support for exactly, is it 1.2 or should it be less than that? By 2028, is 2 times a multiplier too big or not enough? There was more disagreement on how steeply, I suppose, those penalties come in for this red packaging.
Okay, and so let me just ask you a question, which I don't think you can possibly know the answer to, but I'd love to get your view. If amber is the base fee, so like amber's just like whatever we've decided needs to be covered. If it's £2 billion, you're like, okay, this much needs to go for a base fee. Then you've got the red on top, which is a multiplier, and the green, which is discounted from the red. If everyone suddenly stopped making red packaging, if everyone went, okay, this is so clear that actually we're not going to use carbon black, for example, and we're going to stop making red, do you think the government will then nudge what red is so that over time our packaging gets so good? You know, you're in a position where it's like a PET bottle with an HDPE lid is red because actually we want a PET bottle with a PET lid, for example. Do you think actually they will just keep adjusting what red means, because there will be items of packaging that become extinct because they're in the red group if it's like a 2-3 times multiple?
That's what they hope will happen ultimately. So that would be a nice problem to have, how to raise the standards of what packaging is deemed to be green and good and out of the red. So that will evolve over time. And as I say, PAC UK will be looking at this methodology on an annual basis to say, how do we need to tinker with what we define in this traffic light system based on new processes coming on board for recycling stuff, but also based on the fact that certain packaging formats might disappear over time, and we kind of hope they do. We've talked a lot in recent episodes about PVC, for example. That's a great example of something that is already disappearing and will be pushed into disappearance even more by the fact it will be defined as red under this system.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And it is very reassuring, by the way, looking through those red things, thinking, we've covered that on the podcast, we've covered that on the podcast, and we've said all of them are bad. So that's really good.
Yeah.
Like, it makes me feel like we do know what we're talking about, Robbie. It's worth just noting a few things are exempt from the RAM. So reusable packaging you would report as reused, and you would just cover it on the first trip. Packaging that's exported, drinks containers that are linked to DRS, so again, plastic bottles, aluminium cans, they are covered by DRS, not EPR. So they'll have a fee linked to deposit return schemes. And any non-household packaging, we're only talking about household packaging here. So those are things that are exempt. I just thought it was worth probably giving some examples, just working through an example of how the RAM works. There's a few things that are always red. No matter what you do to them, they're always going to be red. So, for example, a packaging with integrated electricals. I don't think we talked about those. So there were some shocking ones over Christmas, you know, where...
Oh, really?
Yeah, where you had like a little chocolate bar or something. I think it was a chocolate bar, and it was like in a big piece of packaging where you pressed a button and snow flew around it.
Oh, my word, really?
Yeah, yeah.
How do those still exist? Anyway, going to be red under this RAM.
Unfortunately, I'm going to call out M&S here who were selling that. But anyway, there we go. We've got to stop putting electricals in packaging. I mean, that should always be red and should be like 5 times the cost. You've got PFAS. We talked about forever chemicals, so PFAS that you can find in straws, things like that. If that's been intentionally added to like cardboard and plastic, it's always red because that's a forever chemical. We shouldn't be using it. And any household packaging within the scope of the RAM which has not been assessed. So again, we just talked about that a bit earlier. You've got to assess your packaging. You've got to check it. Otherwise, it will default to red.
Yeah, and the companies would be mad not to do this.
Yeah.
Some of the stuff is not that complicated or technical to assess as being recyclable. So you should at least go through the low-hanging fruit, the very easy stuff. It does get a lot more technical the more complicated your packaging is, but there is plenty of recyclable packaging. We recycle something like 80-odd% of packaging that's placed onto the market in the UK. So there's an awful lot that is recyclable, frankly.
So the way the RAM works is it sort of looks at the same things we do with our podcast, so collection, sorting and recycling. And it looks at that for each of the material types. So if we just talk through like paper and cardboard, because that's quite easy. Collection for paper and cardboard, is mostly widely collected. Most councils collect cardboard. In fact, 100% of councils collect cardboard. But they don't all collect fibre-based composite. So if there's a fibre-based composite that's got plastic on both sides, which is like a cup that you might get from a restaurant, so that will have plastic on both sides, that would be seen as red. If your cardboard or paper had glitter stuck to it, that would be red. Greaseproof paper, which is silicone, that would be red. A padded polyethylene lined envelope, so sometimes you get those like FedEx envelopes that have plastic on the inside, that would be red. So that gives you an example of collection. What they've done is said most paper and board is green. And here's some red examples. If you're using glitter, greaseproof paper, you've got a padded plastic envelope. They then move into the sorting, and for the sorting to be green, or for the sorting not to be red, I should say. So for the sorting not to be red, 2 dimensions of the item must be 4 centimetres. And this is why we talk about tennis balls, although a tennis ball is actually 6.5 centimetres, so we tend to...
Did you check it?
Yeah, well, we do go a bit bigger deliberately because I just think it's easier to remember. So it's a bit smaller than a tennis ball, but in most of the discussion with the RAM, it's 4 centimetres on 2 dimensions. But that, again, that's all about size. We've talked about that with sorting. And then finally, recycling for paper and cardboard, the non-paper element cannot be greater than 15% if it's not a fibre-based composite. So if it's just paper and something else and it isn't like a coffee cup, then you can have up to 15% of plastic. If you have more than 15%, then it goes into the red.
And that is such a great motivation, coming back to what we were talking earlier, and that paper bottle in Greater Manchester, the Smirnoff bottle, a reason to make sure that you're getting it below those thresholds to make sure you're not overpaying.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other one that's interesting, I guess, other than cardboard is like flexible plastic. So let's quickly run through that. Collection for flexible plastic. For something to be green, it needs to be collected by more than 75% of councils. And they said in the RAM that no flexible plastic in any council exceeds 14% collection. So that means that the flexible plastic isn't collected enough to be green, so that'll be red. But, Robbie, it's coming in 2027, isn't it? Collections from our households?
Yeah, so it'll be collected from all households in England, so it will very quickly go up to, as long as all the councils comply with the law, 100% collection.
Okay, great. So then the collection side of it will be green, and then we move into sorting. So again, for something to be not red in sorting, it can't use carbon black, and it can't have an aluminium foil layer. So again, this is why lots of brands are looking at mono material, so single material flexibles, because those layers will push you into the red category. And then finally, for recycling, what we're really looking for in flexibles, as we've said on this podcast, is polyolefins. And the polyolefins are polyethylene and polypropylene, so PE, PP. Any other plastic would start moving it into the red category. So if it contained PET, PVC, and you need a minimum of 80% polyolefins for it to start moving out of the red category. Interestingly, this is where they talk about things like oxo-degradable and compostable. If plastic is oxo-degradable or compostable or contains anything that makes it oxo-degradable or compostable, it is red because of the recycling of that plastic. So where we've talked in the past about oxo-degradable and we've talked in the past about compostable, and we've said, look, we don't think they're great because the infrastructure isn't there and it doesn't make sense in some instances for plastic to break down fast. The government are also saying that through the Recyclability Assessment Methodology. I mean, just walking through these examples and giving people a flavour of what this is like, because we can't go through it all, I think this is pretty good. People, or the government, through DEFRA, through PAC UK, are defining what good looks like. And in my opinion, this is what packaging needs. It's always going to annoy people. It doesn't matter what you do. You're always going to annoy somebody. Are the OXO guys happy that OXO's always red? Probably not. I wouldn't be. But I think it's really good for PAC UK to say, look, this is the packaging that we think is most collected, sorted and recycled. And this is the packaging that we don't think is collected, sorted and recycled. And then for industry to come in and comment on that and improve it over time.
And then basically what they're filling the void of in the last decade or so is leadership on recycling. And it's the leaderships that's required. means that there's some brave decisions and people's nose will be put out of joint. You can't make an omelette without cracking some eggs, unfortunately. So it is absolutely not perfect, but generally, as a first year of a first draft of a recyclability assessment methodology, it's pretty good, I must say, and I've been very impressed with the way that quite quickly, as I say, only in the last 6 months, it's gone from who knows what it's going to be to something that is a technical document that you can read through and at least understand the rules. You might disagree with some of those rules because you're in a certain format, or you personally wish that a particular material got collected more or went through material recovery facilities more easily. But the reality is it's a great start and it will only get better over time.
Yeah, now we do say this from a very luxurious position, Robbie, because we are not a brand who has to go through hundreds and hundreds of lines and go, what does this mean again? Which one is it? And how do I change it? And how do I improve it? So, I can understand why brands are like, look, this is so complicated. It doesn't work. There's too many iterations. There's too many possibilities. It's too difficult to know what good and bad is. But I think unless you do it this way, it's too vague. And I think you have to be specific about what good and bad is. And I think that's pretty good. I think the complexity really, as you've said in episode 39, Robbie, the bit that gets really complicated is when you're mixing weight and RAM. So the first part is EPR, that's weight. And this is where the glass guys are annoyed because glass is heavy, so their cost is high, and plastic is light, so their cost is low. When you then apply the red and green, if you're multiplying a low cost by 2, it's got less impact than if you're multiplying a heavy cost, a high cost, by 1. And so what is happening, and you mentioned this before, but just to reiterate, you can be in a position where a red material, like a plastic, I can't use a plastic bottle because that's in DRS, but a flexible plastic, so in this example, like our Nescafe Gold that you were talking about, you can be in a situation where a red material is way cheaper than a green material that is heavier. And that is the frustration of this, that actually the red-green thing is part of the calculation, but if you're multiplying a low cost versus a high cost, it doesn't always make that difference.
That's exactly right. And if you take it a step further than just the weight of things and say, well, is recycling the only metric to grade packaging on in terms of fees? You've got all sorts of other metrics, including water use, energy use, carbon intensity, etc. And that's the thing that lots of people hope becomes simpler over time and gets added to the methodology. It's not just recyclability. But it's already complicated for just recyclability. The assessments, as you mentioned, are already quite complex and hard, especially mostly for retailers who just have inordinate amounts of different types of complicated packaging because they sell so many different types of products. To then add on top of that some sort of life cycle analysis or carbon analysis is going to be way, way, way more complicated than this recyclability assessment methodology. So that's why they haven't done it from the get-go, but they might do it in 5 to 10 years' time.
Rubbish or not? So today's Rubbish or Not is from WhatsApp. Thank you, Lauren, for WhatsApping me and asking me whether staples can be recycled. What do you reckon, Robbie? Staples?
Staples, it sort of feels like, yeah, they can, but they're tiny, aren't they? Going back to our recyclability assessment methodology.
They are not 4 centimetres on 2 dimensions,
absolutely.
That's for sure.
And they are packaging, aren't they? Or they can be packaging because they're sort of used to package the product, to reinforce a cardboard box, for example.
Yeah, it depends on how they're used. It's like wrapping paper. I often give the example of wrapping paper. If you're buying wrapping paper as a product in a shop, it's not packaging. But if someone in the shop offers to gift wrap something for you, it's just become packaging. And it's sort of the same with staples. If it's used within a packaging material, used in a cardboard box, then it's packaging. If it's just holding a few bits of paper together, it's not packaging.
So anyway, they're small, but surely this metal is going to come out at the end of a process, even if it gets burnt. So I'm going to say it's or not.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, but for the listener, this is classic. It depends. We love it. It depends, don't we? So, I think you'll right to say, well, look, it's likely to come out of the recycling process, because what's going to happen is if you leave it in your paper or cardboard, which is what I think we would advise to keep it bigger, if you leave it in your paper or cardboard stapled in, then it's going to get filtered out at the paper mill. It's going to get sieved out. They will then send what they filtered out to be incinerated, and it will come out of the incinerator bottom ash because it's metal. That's what you're saying, yeah?
Yeah.
So it's recyclable. In terms of what we're advising our listeners to do, it's probably just leave it in the cardboard or paper.
Yeah, no, you're right. Okay. I definitely don't be pulling them out and trying to find a way of depositing the tiny little pieces of metal. I don't think that's what we can
But I think
advise.
it is recycling because you have to put it in the cardboard bin.
Yes.
So don't
Okay.
put it in your general bin. It's definitely best in the recycling bin. Now, if you want to be the best recycler you possibly can be, I suppose you could take a steel can, because they're made of steel. You could take a steel tin can, like a baked bean can, and you could fill it with staples if you get through a lot of staples in your life, and then maybe use some foil to close it off, I guess. And then
or press it shut in some way.
Yeah, the recyclers will then be able to extract that when they shred it up. But I still think even then, once it's been shredded, it might get lost. So I think just leave it in cardboard and paper and put it in the paper bin. Rubbish question. So we had Mike on WhatsApp, who was not explicitly asking a question, I must admit. He was just sharing a video with me, which was that classic viral video that comes around every so often. Every few years, someone goes viral with it, where they've dissolved the metal off an aluminium can and they go, look, there's loads of plastic inside this.
The classic. I know what you're talking
it
about.
happens
I've
all the
seen
time.
that so many times over the years, yeah.
So I spun it into a question. Do cans really contain plastic?
Well, that's an easy answer. Yes, they do. Someone's not just made up this video. It is a scientific experiment that you can do, and I've seen many times.
I tell you, you should do that. I think they use like hydrogen peroxide or something.
Really?
Maybe we
Yeah,
should.
I wouldn't advise it.
Just watch the video. But yeah, most cans are lined with like an epoxy resin. You can actually see that on like a steel can. If you get your steel can just before you put your staples in it, you know, you can feel that plastic on the inside. Like sometimes the inside of steel cans are like white, aren't they? And that's just that is the epoxy resin that's been added to it. And the reason they do that is because certain things like tomatoes specifically, that's why there's bits of plastic in tomato puree tubes, or like Coca-Cola or a fizzy drink, they're likely to corrode metal. I'm not going to discuss what they do to our insides, these fizzy drinks, but you know, they will corrode metal. And so they put bits of plastic on the inside to keep that safe, basically, to stop it tasting metallic and to stop the metal like starting to corrode. So people kind of are like, why are they doing this? Why are they hiding plastic? Well, trust me, it would be a lot worse if they didn't have that plastic lining in there.
Yeah, no, that's totally right. And I suppose it comes down to, does this plastic make it unrecyclable like it does when there's 15+% of it attached to paper, as we mentioned earlier? And that's the key bit, isn't it?
Yeah, well, the plastic's just burnt off in the recycling process. It's got a way lower melting point than metal, so it will just disappear, it'll get skimmed off.
Yeah, so it doesn't render them unrecyclable. It's on literally every single can you've ever drunk and not really thought about, and just assumed it was an aluminium can only.
It's also so thin that it's just a tiny, tiny percentage. It's a very, very thin layer of plastic. Now, one health concern around this is BPA. So we'll talk about BPA on a different episode because it's kind of its own health thing. But people will have heard of BPA. Certainly if you buy like a reusable water bottle, I bet it says on it like BPA free.
Yeah.
And it is sometimes found in canned food. And there was a study in 2010 that found that 73% of canned foods that they looked at contained BPA. Now, the EU has literally just approved a ban on BPA with food contact with an 18-month phase out. So we're sort of in this process. It had already been banned for things like infant bottles and anything to do with babies basically and children, but it will be coming on all food contact applications, I think, except for a couple. I can't remember them, but there's a couple where it's like practically impossible to avoid BPA.
Sure.
But I suspect for cans that isn't one of them. And the UK will likely need to comply with that, even though Brexit means we don't have to. The reality is so much of our trade is with the EU that we would have to comply with that as well. So we'll do a separate episode on BPA, but certainly that is a health hazard that comes with having a bit of plastic in our cans if that's in there. If you want to see that viral video that occasionally goes around, I'll include the link to that in our link tree if you haven't seen it. Great. Thank you, Robbie. Another episode. How are you feeling?
Yeah, really good. Good to actually do the recyclability assessment methodology. We've been asked, haven't we, in person and online about it so many times. So hopefully that's helped people out to understand what exactly is going on.
And we've been threatening to do it for ages.
Yeah.
We've been saying for ages we need to do a recyclability assessment methodology episode.
I'm sure it'll come up again in the following months and years on the podcast. It's not going away anytime soon. And it's really a great thing that's hopefully going to drive more recyclable products to the average person's home.
Great. So again, as always, we really, really love you guys listening in, and we just appreciate all the interactions we're getting. So thank you so much for that. We got lots on Discord this week, as you can see from the things we've talked about in this episode. So make sure you get on over to Discord. The link is in our show notes. You can contact us via email, which is talkingrubbishpodcast@gmail.com. You can follow us at Rubbish Podcast across all social media. And leave us a review.
Please leave us a review. I'm
Robbie's very
so
keen.
looking forward to reading through them and reading them out. So you could be the lucky person to get your review on next week.
As always, we will see you next week. Bye.
Bye.